This is going to be quite a long video, and in this video I would like to explore a couple of ideas that I've got about the basis for reality as we perceive it anyway. There's reality that is quite complex. There's a lot going on in reality. We interact with it in many different ways and it's quite complex as a whole. So reality isn't simply just, nothingness, for example. There's a lot more to it than that. And a lot of people have grappled with this problem, and it is especially one of those things that creationists love to throw at atheists, because they think that it somehow shows the inconsistency of an atheistic worldview. They love to point out to us that, so they believe anyway, that we think that reality was created out of nothing. Now, first of all, I would like to point out something that has been pointed out by many different people already, but it is something that bears repeating, so I'm going to say it. Isn't that a little bit like the pot calling the kettle black? Really, if you think about it, right? In the end, what they are claiming themselves is that some cosmic magician called God created, wait for it, reality out of nothing, by magic. They somehow seem to think that because they don't see that magician and the magic in an atheistic worldview, that if the atheistic worldview were to be based on the premise that everything was created from nothing, that it would be somehow less valid than their own worldview. Of course, the same problem exists with both interpretations. The problem lies with the idea that everything was created from nothing. That is where the real problem lies. Of course, if we dig it tiny little bit deeper, we'll soon come to the realization that, at least on the atheistic side of this so perceived dichotomy here, the creationists have got it completely wrong. Atheists do not generally believe that reality was created out of nothing. In actual fact, the whole idea that reality could have been created out of nothing is preposterous. And this, of course, may seem very counterintuitive, especially if you're looking at, say, a cosmological model that has our universe have an origin in something called the Big Bang. And if you then consider the possibility that a universe might indeed be all there is, then we are looking at a reality that extends a finite amount of time into the past. And that is, of course, where the creationist, tiny little pea-brained mind does its backflips. They see a finite past and they then jump to the conclusion that reality must have been created. Let's just take that argument and turn it onto its head for a moment. Let's see what would be implied by the idea that reality was created. Think about it. If reality was created out of nothing, that statement implies that there must have been a time in the past, a moment in time, a period of time, whatever, in which there was no reality. Try to imagine such a time, and you'll soon realize that the whole premise is ridiculous. It is ridiculous to think that there was a time in which there was no reality, including time. You see what the problem is here? In other words, therefore, that premise can be rejected out of hand. It's ridiculous. Therefore, there are no moments in time in which there was no reality. And that therefore means, by definition, that reality cannot have been created, and more importantly, that reality has always existed. The problem is not in that statement. It is perfectly reasonable to say that reality has always existed. The problem is that people cannot get their head around the fact, the possible fact anyway, that always might encompass just a finite amount of time. The reason why it's always is because there is no time outside that frame. There's nothing outside that frame. Therefore, reality has always existed. And this is just a preamble into what I'm going to be talking about next. I told you it's going to be a long video. And now we're getting into the meat of it. Now, I have made a series of videos in the past, and this series was called Something from Nothing. It was exploring how the existence of certain things might follow by logical implication out of assuming nothing whatsoever. And the example that I started with in that series was this example of the natural numbers. I'm going to just revisit that very quickly, because it is important that you understand where I was coming from there. We started off by assuming that we had a frame of reference, say, in which we could consider the extent of our knowledge, right? And we started off with nothing in there at all. It was an empty frame, like in this particular box here, as I'm showing now, and there was basically just nothing in there. The interesting bit started when we started considering what we could talk about with regard to all that we were aware of. In this case, we were aware of nothing inside this framework. So we could, for example, look at lumping everything we were aware of together in the one place, in what's called a set. Now obviously that would be very simple. What we would end up creating there would be something called the empty set, which is a set with nothing in it, and a fairly basic mathematical construction. We can then repeat that process, and that's the first interesting thing that we can do here. We can repeat this process and start looking at all we are aware of again. Now we are aware of this thing that we've just constructed, being the empty set. So now, if we repeat the process of creating a set of all the things that we are aware of, then we have to now create a set that contains this one thing called the empty set. Now we are aware of the empty set and the set that contains the empty set. We can repeat the whole process again and construct yet another set, being a set containing the empty set and this other set. We can repeat this ad infinitum, and what we would be creating is more and more nested sets, which notation wise would become so cumbersome that in the end I'm just going to label them as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even though I want you to keep in mind that those numbers are just there because we are all familiar with them. They don't mean anything at this very moment in time. However, if you looked at these individual sets and looked what was in them, and looked at a property that mathematicians call the cardinality of the set, then you would see something very interesting if we were to order the sets in the order in which we constructed them and looked at their cardinalities. And we would see that the cardinalities would get bigger and bigger. In fact, the cardinalities of these sets, including the empty set, which contains 0 elements, would form what we are commonly familiar with as the natural numbers, including 0. So we would be able to look at these sets as if they were numbers. And that's the argument, that's where I left the argument last time. So I pointed out that the natural numbers were basically bootstrapped out of nothing by simply looking at awareness of nothing in different types of ways. And so the natural numbers, because you always have to remember that when we are presented with a mathematical construction like this, even though I'm presenting this to you in a narrative, and a narrative of course has a beginning, a middle and an end, what you're looking at here does not involve a temporal element. This constructing of sets does not happen over time. This is all by logical implication, and basically by taking the assumption, the awareness of nothing at all, you can show that this implies that there must exist all these sets, and therefore the natural numbers do exist. In other words, the natural numbers must, by definition, exist. Their existence is necessary in reality. There cannot be a reality without the natural numbers, because even if we were to somehow extract these out of reality and present you with a reality that wasn't there, they would immediately be reconstructed by this mathematical implication. And that's very important. Reality, therefore, is never a nothingness. It's never something that contains nothing at all, that is empty altogether, out of which something needs to be created out of nothing, which is indeed impossible. Reality always possesses these natural numbers, for example. But it would be quite valid at first glance for somebody to point out that, okay, so you can assert with confidence that reality would, first of all, always exist, and it would always contain such things as, say, the natural numbers. You can take them as given, as necessarily existing, but that does not necessarily produce a reality that is as rich and complex as the one that we see around us, does it? Well, I would like to challenge that assertion, and in order to do that, I want to take you that tiny little bit further into that numerical argument that I presented to you. Because, yes, I could quite easily understand why somebody would look at how something as abstract as the natural numbers needs to necessarily exist, and look at reality and see no correlation there, other than the fact that in reality we can count things. Well, let's take what we did that tiny step further. We've looked at two very simple operations that created a very simple, a very simple system of things, right? We created an empty set by simply taking a sideways glance at what we were aware of if we removed everything from our awareness. And secondly, we created a set with containing the empty set, the set with cardinality 1, by simply repeating that process. Now any following set would be completely trivial because they would be simply repetition after repetition after repetition after repetition. So it is a little bit boring to just look at this from the perspective of something called the natural numbers. But let's take the one next step first of all and consider what it would take to produce the following set in the process. The set that contained the empty set and the set containing the empty set, which is the set with cardinality 2, or in other words, the number 2. Now if we looked at this set and we were looking at it from the perspective of what would it take for us to get from nothing at all to that set, we would see that it would take a double repetition, if you know what I mean. It would take 2 steps. By doing so, we've introduced a new number called 2. Now, after we've done that, we can revert back to a step that we already are aware of, the step of repetition. So we can simply repeat that, and so by starting at the number 2, we arrive at the number 4, and similarly at the number 6, and the number 8, and the number 10, and so on. So again, we're going to dismiss those numbers out of hand, and I've done this by coloring the sets as they are hit by this repeating process. And we're going to look at the beginning again, and we're going to look at, is there anything that wasn't produced by this simple repetition? And the first set that we see there is set S3, which corresponds with the number 3. So we look at what it takes to produce that out of nothing, and by doing that we produce the number 3. We can now start repeating this process again. We use that simple step of repetition again. And what do we get? We get the number 6, which we've already arrived at using the number 2, the number 9, which is a new number, and so on and so forth. We can do this again, and we see that we've already stopped at number 4, so we're going to ignore that. The next number that we couldn't arrive at this way is number 5. You are seeing at this stage, I would hope, what I'm doing here. I've introduced just a simple new concept, trying to arrive at sets and how to get there, and by doing this I've created now a simple mechanism that would generate all the prime numbers. Now what's so special about prime numbers? And that is where it gets really interesting. You see, I've just shown you that we can arrive at all the prime numbers through arriving at all the natural numbers from assuming nothing whatsoever. So again, the fact that these numbers are prime is a natural consequence of making no a priori assumptions. Therefore, prime numbers are logically necessary. They have to exist in reality. By the way, I do not buy into the concept of a metaphysical reality. In my world view, the natural numbers are as real as the sofa that I'm sitting on. They're just abstract maybe, but they're still real. They still exist in reality, so to speak. And so do obviously now the prime numbers. They do exist in reality. But the prime numbers are something that people have been looking at for centuries now, and they are still not entirely sure what's going on with these prime numbers. As you've seen, the process of constructing all the prime numbers is very simple indeed. It can be done by a child without any a priori assumptions, without any sophisticated mathematics, you can generate all the prime numbers. In fact, what I showed you there is very similar to the sieve of Eratosthenes, I think it's called, which is used to produce the prime numbers in a very clumsy and cumbersome way. But it works, and it is absolutely 100% guaranteed to work. Now, before I get into something more important about them, I would like to just play with you a little bit with prime numbers. The first thing that I want to talk to you about is the proof that was produced that all the prime numbers, that there is an infinite number of prime numbers, that you'll never be able to get to a number that would be the last ever prime number. That might not be immediately obvious, because you might think that, you know, as you get to larger and larger numbers, eventually you might possibly get to a point where every number you get to would be divisible by something that went before it. Very tempting, but also wrong. And the proof that that is true is, again, quite simple if you think about it. The person who came up with it was very smart, came up with a very simple idea. He used reductio ad absurdum to prove that there must be an infinite number of primes. Basically what they did is that he said, let's assume for a moment that there aren't an infinite number of primes. There is therefore a number, a prime number p, which is the largest prime in the universe. Now let's create a new number, and basically the new number is produced by multiplying all the primes that exist from 2 all the way up to this magical number p, multiply them together, which is a humongous number, obviously. Now add 1. What is special about that number? Well, think about it. Is it divisible by 2? No, because the original multiplication was divisible by 2. So if you add 1 to it, that number cannot be divisible by 2. The same is true for 3. It cannot be divisible by 5 either. It cannot be divisible by 7. It cannot be divisible by 11. Any prime you can pick, any prime that you know of, from 2 all the way up to this magical prime number p, the largest prime in the universe, this huge number that you created by multiplying them all together and adding 1 to it, is not divisible by any of these primes. What does that mean? Well, that means that that number must therefore be either a prime itself or the product of primes that are all larger than p. There must therefore be numbers larger than p that are prime. Therefore, assuming that there is a largest number of primes, that there is a largest prime, leads to the contradiction that there must therefore be larger primes. Therefore the assumption must be wrong. Therefore there is no largest prime. Therefore there is an infinite number of primes. That's a good one. Another one is this one. Is there a largest possible gap in the list of numbers, of natural numbers, in which all the numbers in that gap are not primes? Now, for example, all the primes are pretty much separated by 2, except 2 and 3. But after that, well, between every prime and every next prime, there has to be at least one even number, which is divisible by 2, and which is not a prime. But is there a maximum gap there? Is there a gap above which you cannot go? No, there isn't. And the way to prove that is very clever indeed, and it's similar enough to the one that was used for producing the proof that there is an infinite number of primes. Say you want to prove that there is a gap of at least 100 numbers that are all not primes. How would you prove that? Well, look at this number. The number 100 followed by an exclamation mark, which basically is shorthand for multiplying 1 by 2 by 3 by 4 by 5 by 6 by 7 by 8 and so on. Yeah. Again, you're talking about an absolutely massive number. But let's look at that number, right? It's a huge multiplication, it's a massive number. But what can we say about that number? Well, it's divisible by all these numbers that went into it. So if we look at that number plus 2, because the number itself is divisible by 2, it is divisible by 2. The number plus 3, because the number itself is divisible by 3, the number plus 3 is also divisible by 3. The same is true for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up to 100. That means that if you take that number, multiplying all the numbers from 1 to 100 with each other, and start adding 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you'll get a gap of 99 numbers that are all not prime. So for every number, no matter how large, if you do this same thing, you can produce a gap of that number minus 1, which are all not prime. In other words, there is no largest possible gap in which all the numbers are not prime. Okay, now you're in the mood for a bit of philosophy, I would think. What has all this talk about prime numbers got to do with reality? This is where it gets interesting. You see, the problem with primes is that they're not as easy to predict as you might think. As I showed you, the process of creating the primes can be very, very simple indeed. And yet, given a number, people find it extremely hard to test whether that number is a prime. In actual fact, that is what an awful lot of cryptography is currently based on the fact that factorizing primes or factorizing large numbers is so devilishly hard to do, and therefore you can produce codes that are based on multiplying two enormous primes, and rest assured that factorizing that huge number into the two constituting primes is going to be next to impossible. Obviously, as technology moves on, we might have to rely on larger and larger and larger numbers to keep our encryptions safe, but the principle behind it is still fairly sound, and it is still something that people have not been able to crack. Quantum computers may be able to, if they ever get created, may be able to address the problem by applying the brute force solution, but in a compressed sort of time frame, by superimposing all the calculations on top of each other and doing them all simultaneously, which is all lovely, but it does not make the problem itself any simpler. So we are still in this position where we simply cannot predict whether a given number is a prime or not with 100% accuracy. And people have been looking at this for centuries now, starting with Gauss, for example, and Riemann has been looking at this as well. They are two famous mathematicians. And the funny thing about this is that people have been making all sorts of guesses, wild guesses, as to what predictability there may be in the prime numbers. Again, in the vain hope, so far anyway, that we might be able to come up with a formula, a way of generating prime numbers automatically and very, very quickly. There has even been, at some stage, the suggestion that the distribution of prime numbers amongst all the other natural numbers might be random, And to a large extent, that does seem to be the case. When Gauss produced formulas to try and guesstimate the number of primes within the natural numbers up to a certain number n, he came up with a formula involving logarithms, which I'm not going to get into, that was based on a more or less random distribution, and that appeared to be very, very accurate. The thing is that, first of all, intuitively, that does not seem to be right. When prime numbers can be generated with a very simple deterministic mechanism, how could their distribution be completely random? That never sat right with me anyway. In any case, it has turned out that the distribution, while it seems to be very, very close to random, is in fact not random, but chaotic. Now, there may not seem to be a huge difference between the two, at least not conceptually speaking, or in the way we would experience randomness versus chaos. But the thing is that chaos is, at least in principle, based on predictable mechanisms, and given enough accuracy, you can produce the outcome of a chaotic process with increasing accuracy, even though you might never be able to produce it exactly. But of course we're talking mathematics, not physics, so there may be a solution there. All this depends to a very large extent on somebody being able to crack something called the Riemann hypothesis or the Riemann conjecture. But that is taking this way too far. And that's just short for I don't get it. Okay? Anyway, that is neither here nor there. What I wanted to point out to you is something that in the whole investigation of the distribution of the prime numbers, as people started looking at the possibility that they were distributed randomly across the natural numbers, the discovery that the distribution is not random, even though it is highly chaotic. At some point, the discovery was made that the prime numbers are distributed in a manner that looked very familiar to some. And I'm sorry I forgot the name of the scientists involved. I'm going to look them up and post them in the video description. But they found, one of the mathematicians working on this problem and who found this distribution that was not quite random, showed it to a physicist. And they recognized the distribution immediately. They recognized it as a distribution of energy levels. Think about that for a moment. Something as mathematically abstract as the distribution of prime numbers within the set of natural numbers is mirrored in nature by atomic energy levels. That shows very clearly that there is a deep link, mathematically speaking, between physical reality and these abstract entities called numbers. And these abstract entities are logically necessary. You cannot have a reality that does not include them, because they follow naturally from no a priori assumption. They have a clear mirror in something that happens in physical nature, and therefore it is conceivable. I am not able, I'm going to admit that straight away, right here, I am not able to make this link. But I can now conceive quite easily of a reality that bootstraps itself, that must by logical necessity exist, simply based on the fact that things such as natural numbers and prime numbers must exist, and that can be as complex, as beautiful, as magnificent as the reality that we perceive, that we live in, that we are engaged in, without the need for a creator, without the need for anything magically to appear out of nothing, by simple logical necessity. This is completely uncharted territory, and I could be completely wrong. I could be talking out of my back passage, but I certainly would think that from these considerations it would be very foolish to simply dismiss the possibility that reality necessarily has to be the way it is, out of hand, without any need for gods, supernatural entities, or any magic for it to be created. It just is the way it is because it has to be. Think about that.